Welcome to Business Owner Tales from the Trenches, the podcast for business owners who want to see around corners and thrive financially. Your host is Carr, CEO and business owner at CornerCap. Tune in every other week for lessons learned from the trenches of entrepreneurship, business successes, and financial independence. Here's Cannon.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the show. Cannon, Carr, and Claudia Bettinger with you in the studio today. Today, we are airing part 2 of our blockbuster conversation with Dave Sutton. If you remember, in part 1, we spent time on defining your exit, kind of the when, why, and how, and even the who, as well as creating how do you create that diversified financial independence from your business. So great episode. Go back and listen to it. Very rich conversation there. Today, we're focusing on part 2 of that conversation, which is how you think about funding your business as it grows and really how to use your balance sheet. And so it's some great things. We'll get into it. But Claudia, why don't you just remind us of Dave's background?
Yeah, absolutely. Dave Sutton is at the forefront of marketing services and strategies, both as a serial entrepreneur and author. For the past 18 years, he has been managing partner of Blue Rhino Capital, which provides strategic investments for middle market companies, along with other endeavors. He's also founded, grown, and sold 3 companies in marketing services, and he serves on many boards and advisory groups for business owners, including YPO.
Well, Dave's got a great background, extensive experience, and so a rich conversation. And as you listen to it, maybe keep 2 big points in mind. The first one is listen to how he talks about those inflection points that your business hits as it grows and the implications it has for funding it, for hiring talent, and for planning your business. So key points there. And then the second one is listen to how Dave talks about how to understand the balance sheet of your business. Many entrepreneurs don't really understand their balance sheet to the extent they need to, kind of its strengths and weaknesses, and the role capital can play. Dave spends some great time talking about how and when to use third-party capital to achieve what you want to do. So great conversation. We'll be back at the end to kind of summarize it, but sit back and listen to this great conversation with Dave Sutton.
When times are good, right? This is the age-old saying, right? Everything's possible.
Sure.
When the business is booming, everything's possible. And that is the right time to look at recapping a business. I mean, I think I told you my story where I was one of those people, like, I hated debt. I thought debt was the word. I was like, I think maybe when I was growing up, my parents said, don't ever take on any debt. That's bad. Mm-hmm. But, in hindsight, if I had been more strategic in terms of taking on debt, I mean, I'm not talking about working capital. I'm talking about, strategic, growth capital, right? Mm-hmm. I've been a little bit more thoughtful about that. I probably could have grown my business a lot faster than I did.
Yeah.
But if you come into it with a mindset like I had, which is debt bad, everything's got to be based on sweat equity or retained earnings, right? Mm-hmm. If you have that mindset, it blocks out opportunity, in your own way of looking at the business. And that's, again, a reason why it's helpful to have someone kind of sitting on your shoulder that's, saying, look, I know you hate taking on debt, right? Mm-hmm. But in this particular circumstance, when interest rates are at 1%, as opposed to today where it's, to go get mezz debt, it's probably 13 or 15%.
13, 14, yeah.
Cannon better than I, but, I was growing my business in an environment where I probably could have easily gotten mezz debt for, 4 or 5 points. And man, looking back now, that would have been cheap money.
Right. You're like, why not give that every day? Well, interesting. And we'll get to the kind of the capital financing side of things in a moment, but you're making a great point about the strategic value of debt. There are a lot of coaches out there who advise against using debt, right? And we'll get into that profit and interest and growth. But your point being a good one of the strategic value of debt. And I remember when you and I talked too, the value of the partner that you have as the debt provider is so important. But I did want to pivot too. I mean, you talked a little bit about how, weathering the storm on the way to your exit and success. And ultimately that means being able to manage disruptions. And, as you look back on the businesses you built, and then ultimately, sold or exited, did any of them encounter a disruption that required you to have to pivot and change that for a moment, maybe you thought this isn't going to make it?
Yeah, I actually went through, I won't go through all of them, but I went through 3 biggies, right? I went through the .com bust of 2001 that mini recession, I guess you could call it at that point in time. I went through the 08-09 financial crisis. And then most recently, I went through COVID, right, with the COVID downturn. Each one of them were very different. And I would say our businesses were at different levels of maturity in their ability to pivot during those times. And I mean, the one that was probably gave me the biggest black eye, quite frankly, was 2008 and 2009, which taught me the lesson of client concentration, right? Like, I think I told you the story, in 08, our biggest customer was a subprime lender that we were essentially doing all of their customer and consumer communications for. I won't name any names, but they were one of the more noteworthy kind of failures of the time. And for those of you that remember, subprime lending was kind of a rage for a very short period of time, and then it became a place you did not want to be. But we had 40% of our business, in that industry, with not only with that one account, but with several. And as a result of that, overnight, literally, I remember having getting phone calls saying, look, I know we've committed budget for 2008, but guess what? We have to cut it. And literally having clients that went out of business in 2 to 3 weeks, from that phone call. So that taught me a lesson around, don't put all your eggs in one basket. Don't have everything that you do kind of aligned with one client or one industry, because you just can't predict what's going to happen. And so from that, at that point forward, we were always very careful about making sure that we had balance, in our, think about it almost like your customer portfolio is like your financial portfolio, your wealth management view. It's got to be diversified and it's got to be balanced, because you just never know where the next punch is going to come from. And that got us ready for COVID. I mean, COVID, unfortunately, was sort of, everybody was impacted. I mean, some industries obviously more than others, but if you were doing any kind of business in consumer-facing businesses in 2020, 21, you had to hunker down. And again, the thing we had done getting ready for that, even before COVID, was, trying to lock in longer-term contracts, because we saw, one of the weaknesses in our business might potentially become one of, if you're working on 30-day, 45, 60-day types of turn in your business, you've got to find some way to make it have longer contracts or ways to kind of stay connected with your customer. And so we were ready to some extent for it. I mean, we came through COVID we had a couple of, black eyes, but nothing damaging to the core business, mainly because we just had locked in a lot of our long-term contracts.
What you'd learned the first time the great financial crisis helped you make better balanced decisions proactively. Exactly. I'm just curious too, as a sidebar, I mean, and I think in some sense, since you were scaling these businesses, you probably already had third-party capital, which we'll get to. But I'm just curious from your own standpoint, many entrepreneurs are reinvesting into the business and not drawing much business for themselves out. Did you see liquidity crises for yourself as just your personally, and how did you navigate those? Or were you already set up ahead of time to have some cushion?
I mean, we, again, going back to the early days of TopRight, we were the bank. I was the bank, right? I mean, I was lucky, and I think I told you this. I mean, I was lucky to some extent because I had sold my public company, taken it private. So I was the bank, right, for a little while at least, which gave, for the hiring employees, they always kind of want to know payroll, you're going to make payroll, right? So it's good to have some kind of, backstop for that. And then as we grew the business, I started to take on more traditional banking relationships for working capital, just to, weather storms. I mean, so much of the things that can kill a small business, especially, a slow paying client, right? A slow paying customer. You don't really think about it until you get into business. But as an entrepreneur, you assume that you send out an invoice and you're going to get it back in 30 days or 45 days.
30 days paid. Yeah.
But, it doesn't work that way. I mean, sometimes that customer is not doing well, or there's a, blip in the system, and something that you expected was going to be there 60 days is now 90 days. But you still got to keep making payroll. So I think having basic working capital lines and taking the time, I did go down the road of making personal guarantees in the beginning, just to get that credit established. And then, the one thing I do like about commercial banks is that over time, if you demonstrate that your ability to pay them back, you can get those PGs removed. And that's another key thing that a lesson I learned not personally, but watching other people, having personal guarantees on businesses can be, and not only does it keep you up at night, but it can kind of putting everything you've got on the line. And so
Yeah.
to your question
Puts you a
about,
lot of personal
yeah.
risk. Right.
Yeah. And to your question about kind of taking some money off the table every once in a while. I mean, if you've got, I would always err on the side of taking, risk off the table first before you pay yourself. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
If that means funding the business in a different way, bringing in an outside partner, looking for growth capital, those are great ways of kind of insulating yourself from potential financial risks that can come associated with putting personal guarantees on businesses.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I love you're making the point. Let's take risk off the table first, then pay yourself. Only because you've got to be paid. And I see a lot of entrepreneurs starving themselves unnecessarily or paying themselves below market rate, which causes a whole bunch of problems. But your point is right. I mean, without some stability in the business in terms of manageable risk, you may have no control on paying yourself. So
that's right.
What a great lens.
Sometimes it's a trade-off between, and we certainly saw this at Top Right, that you've got growth decisions versus risk management decisions, right? So
right.
Do we pay down the line, or do we increase the line, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because we see there's we want to hire 15 people to go after this new project. Those kinds of trade-offs are happening every quarter. You're kind of looking at the business through that lens. And sometimes it makes sense, to be more prudent and, maybe take money off the line, pay down the line so that you're not, feeling like you're, if you do have a stormy month, a client doesn't pay you, whatever, you've got some way of sort of managing your way through it.
Yeah, well, let's explore that just a little bit more. I mean, that idea between should you focus on profit first or should you focus on growth first, and are they mutually exclusive? I mean, how do you begin to frame that decision about where that priority should be and when?
Well, I mean, in the perfect world, it's everybody wants profitable growth, right? That's
Yep.
And again, I can share a little bit more detail on. There's a third dimension that we haven't talked about that much, but the pace of both of those things, right? So, you can grow quickly and make no money. You can also grow profitability slowly, but the top line doesn't look like you're a growth company, right? And there's trade-offs up and down both of those things, but fundamentally, it's about growth, profitability, and time, right?
Pace of it, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the things that I kind of always thought about or still think about in my endeavors today.
Mm-hmm.
I think growth. One of the things, and again, this sometimes it's driven by the industry you're in as well, which I'm kind of more coming from the service industry side of things, but you hear all the time, technology companies will put a ton of money behind growth, and growth, even though it's not, maybe their pro forma says they're not going to be profitable for 3 years or 4 years or 5 years. Personally, and this is kind of a bias of mine, I think those are, that you're in the venture capital game if you're doing it. There's nothing wrong with it, but it's just a different mindset. In the service-based businesses, I truly believe that if you can't turn a profit within the first 12 months, you got a problem. I mean, because let's face it, in most businesses, whether you're professional services, accounting, creative, any service-based industry, if you don't have a good handle on your labor costs and your client pricing model, whatever that model may be, pretty quickly after you start your business, it's not going to get any better. It's not like, adding 10 more clients or adding 10 more customers is going to make the problem go away. If you haven't fundamentally figured out your cost of goods sold versus whatever you charge the customer, right? So I'm a big believer that there's nothing wrong with buying the business, to kind of get things going, maybe losing money on the first couple of accounts. But if you're not profitable within the first 12 months, I personally don't think you're ever going to be profitable because you haven't figured out the fundamental business model. And that said, I mean, there are times and I saw this in you go through inflection points in growing a business. Like I remember, when we hit our first $1 million in revenue, I knew it was hard, right, to get to $1 million in revenue. Getting to 5 was going to be another step, but a bigger step, right? And getting from 5 to 10 was even bigger. And you think it's like a stair step thing. It's actually a pretty steep curve. Yep. And you have to start doing things differently. It's not just about the basic, I'm going to pay somebody $1 and I'm going to charge them out at $3. Whatever, that all of a sudden it's other things that factor into your decision making, like how much do we want to invest in this, client A, because client A is going to become a referral source for us for client B, C, D, E, F, G, right? You start to look at the business through different lenses as you go through those growth inflection points. And those are some of the places where, I was being very transparent with you. I think I made some bad decisions, like going from 5 to 10 could have been a lot faster if I'd had a growth capital partner. Because, for example, simple things like, looking back now, it sounds painfully obvious, but being able to go into new markets. Like if your primary market's Atlanta and you want to get into Boston or you want to get into San Francisco, you can't just assume that you can lift your business where it is right now, plop it down, and everything's going to run the same way. You need investment capital to kind of make those geographic moves. And we just tried to do it off of retained earnings and paying ourselves less money, right? And that, it's not necessarily a bad strategy, but it's just slow, and
slower.
If you want to do one market at a time, that may work. If you want to do 5 markets at a time, it's going to take you, 5 times as long and introduce 5 times as much risk, right? So
yeah. Well, I'm going to come back to that. I want to go back to one other point you made, though. In that, that's almost that step function. $1 million in revenue, then 5 million, then 10, and to get to each stage, maybe is a little bit different cost model or a little bit different set of challenges. So your point is, you've got to prove profitability at each point. It probably checkpoints along the way, and in fact, force yourself into that discipline, right? Say, within 12 months, 18 months, I've got to be showing a profit, even if I am a scaling business, that I'm trying to accelerate things with capital. And at least, I guess point number one, right? That was a key point you were making. But then as you're going across those bridges, I guess you enter a time when you do use growth capital, which will make you unprofitable for a while, but you kind of go into it knowing you've proven the model in some sense.
Right. Or, I know we're talking a lot about, about debt here, but there's also other, and this as well as anybody. There are other ways you could bring in equity. You could bring in a partner. You could make an acquisition. There are other things that we've kind of focused on only certain levers of the balance sheet. But I do think that those inflection points, and I'm being somewhat arbitrary in saying 1, 5, 10, but they feel about right. Yep. But looking at the balance sheet for each of those types of companies, it's very different. The other thing I will say is the expertise that you need. Like, you can run $1 million business with a bookkeeper, right? At 5 million, you better have a darn good controller, and at 10 million, you better have a darn good CFO, right? It's and I'm not necessarily being critical of the talent, for example, the level of talent that we had in our business, fantastic. But sometimes the business is growing faster than the talent is developing. And so sometimes you have to make hard decisions, like, the VP of sales that you had for the $1 million business, I guarantee you by the time you get to 10, they'll either have caught up and they're flying, or you will have fired them, right?
Right. It didn't work.
But a lot of times people don't, and this is another trap I see entrepreneurs fall into, is they know how to grow a business, but they don't necessarily know how to grow the talent to keep up with the business.
Mm-hmm.
That can be a trap. Loyalty, is a wonderful thing, like being loyal to your employees and your employees being loyal to you. But sometimes the people that got you to where you are not the people that are going to get you to where you need to be. And so I always encourage entrepreneurs to, do a 360, include yourself in that, by the way. Do a 360 every year, or certainly do it at those key inflection points to make sure that you've got, the A team at every one of those pivot points. Otherwise, any one of those roles that we've been talking about today, whether it's HR people, CFO, IT people, any one of them, if they're not, keeping up with the pace of growth of the business, it can end up being a significant risk for the business.
Mm-hmm. Is that something you can self-diagnose, or do you need to ultimately hire a third party to do that?
I think, I couldn't. I think there's probably certain entrepreneurs that really have a great eye for talent. I always used to say to people, I was not very good at managing people. I don't think that was my gift. So I tried to bring people in who were better at managing and developing people than I was. It is a gift, and I think it is something that sometimes It could be managed externally, like having, an HR consultant come in and do a 360 every year. Maybe not a bad idea. I think some of those decisions are also are entrepreneurs. Like I said, we're very, generally speaking, we're optimistic, right? So when you're an optimistic leader, you say to yourself, Cannon is going to get, he's not there right now, but he's going to get there, and I'm just going to give him time, right?
Right. Give him time. Have some loyalty.
Yeah.
Right.
And we're generally optimistic. And the problem with that is, like, when you get to the point and you go, Cannon is just not cutting it, and you fire him, or you agree that, hey, Cannon's going to have to move on. And then you look back and you're like, I knew that 2 years ago.
Right.
And I did Cannon a disservice because I kept him, banging away at something that he was never going to be productive with. And I also did a disservice to the business because I knew the answer. I was trying to give him a chance. I was trying to make it work. And sometimes it helps to have an uninterested, unbiased third party look at it and go, you know what? This person's in the wrong position. They should be over here. Or this person needs training, or this person needs to go back and get their MBA. Hire them back 2 years from now. And there's so many different ways you can manage it, but most of the time, entrepreneurs tend to think in very simplistic terms, like fire, hire, and that's not always the best thing for the long-term growth of the business.
Yeah, no, great point. Definitely complex decisions there. Let's go back to those levers of capital just for a moment. We were talking about growth capital. I mean, to me, growth capital is more that equity side. Debt is that, maybe that bridge or that tool. How should a founder or an entrepreneur think about using third-party capital, particularly if they've spent their first, up to $1 million in revenue bootstrapping, right? And just doing a cash-based, and let's say they've been fortunate to be profitable most of that time, right? And reinvesting into the business over that 3 to 5 years and watching cash. Taking on third-party growth capital is a different decision. So how should they think about that?
Well, I think, and this is getting into your area of expertise, but I think what I've seen as an entrepreneur is the financial services world has gotten very complicated, right? So it used to be very simple. It's like you could go borrow money from the bank or from a third-party lender, or you could go out and raise capital and bring in equity on the balance sheet. Now there's all kinds of instruments, as you know, right? So I mean, you can do preferred positions, you can do convertible notes, convertible debt, you can do safe notes. I mean, so the way I look at it, and those are all instruments, by the way, that they're either heavy on the debt side or heavy on the equity side, or someplace in the middle, right? Yep. And they're created to kind of fit a specific need for both the investor and the business owner, right? So when I look at it, and when I was running my business, I needed to teach myself a little bit more about what are some of these instruments, what are some of these different ways that these things are going to impact the business, whether it's short term, I got to make an interest payment now every month, or it's longer term, I just gave away a chunk of the business to someone who's never really going to be in the business working on the business. They're just a passive investor, right? Yep. So those are the kinds of trade-offs that I think people have to go through in their own mind about, do I want someone in here that's going to be in control of my business at one end of the spectrum, right? And, let's face it, if you've got a big debt, and you owe somebody some money, and they hold a UCC lien against your assets, you better believe that if you don't pay, they're going to come in, they're going to try to take control of the assets and sell your business and put you into bankruptcy or whatever, right? So there are consequences of those levers and which ones you decide to pull. By the same token, I mean, if you think that you've got just a diamond of a business, equity is probably the most expensive way to raise money. I mean, you're literally giving away a chunk of your business, a percentage of your business. So if you own 100% of a $10 million business and someone comes in and says, look, I'm going to give you $10 million at a $10 million valuation to go, double the size of the business. You've be careful, because whatever valuation that you set there, you've now given away essentially. Well, you're not giving it away, but you've sold.
You've sold it. Yeah.
You've sold a chunk of your business. And if you really believe that it's worth $100 million and you just, sold 10% of your business for $10 million, you've made a decision. It's not without consequences as well. So I always kind of coach people on what's the purpose, because if you have clarity on why you need the money, debt's generally speaking easier to manage, right? As long as you can make those interest payments, because that debtor, they don't own any of your business. They just have potentially a lien against your assets, or worst case scenario, personal guarantee that you're going to pay. But it gives you the flexibility then to, they're not going to come in and try to tell you how to run your business, right?
Yeah, no, it's a great point.
Equity holders may want to sit on your board. They may want to, be involved. That also can be a positive, because if it's smart money that can open doors for you, can actually maybe make customer introductions for you, or fill some of those gaps that I was describing earlier. Like maybe you've got an equity, board member that's an amazing legal counsel or an amazing financial advisor, right? That can actually bring more than just money. They can bring advice, to the business.
Yeah. Well, the point about purpose is just so spot on there. When you look at an entrepreneur as they manage their financial statement, I think on the income statement, they often don't understand the labor lever, as you alluded to. Also find that they don't necessarily even understand their balance sheet well enough. Would you agree? Do you think that most entrepreneurs understand their balance sheet?
I don't. I think they don't. And I'll speak from my personal experience. I think I learned about it through necessity, right? Like I didn't. I mean, and I've got an MBA. I did, accounting. I did, finance. I took all the basic classes. But until you get into growing a business, you don't really have it. You don't really have you're not forced to really understand how a balance sheet works and what it represents. And then when you start to play with it, you can understand, when people, the word leverage, which I love the word leverage, it now makes sense, right? To me, that, sometimes you can use debt to lever and literally make the business work harder, right? And use that to kind of create opportunities. You don't think about that generally speaking, as an entrepreneur, you don't look at that part of your business in that way, right? You think more customers, more employees, more product, more manufacturing deals, whatever. We kind of tend to go to the mechanics of the business, not the financial mechanics of the business. So, in hindsight, I became sort of a self-taught financial guy, right? And also try to surround myself with, CFOs and people who, make that's their living. That's what they do for their livelihood. And so they have the time to actually think more about the intricacies than I could as an entrepreneur.
Yeah, no, great point. Didn't get to touch on some of the really interesting work you're doing, not only on the marketing front and marketing strategy, but artificial intelligence, machine learning. I mean, your mind is always moving 3 steps ahead. So maybe we can do a podcast in the future about those subjects, because that'd be great to highlight for people.
That'd be terrific. Yeah,
small businesses. If people do want to learn more about your work and what you're doing, what's a good place for them to go to?
BlueRhinoCapital.com, which is my private equity firm. LinkedIn, check out my profile on LinkedIn. It's all out there.
Yeah, that's great. Well, Dave, thanks for the time today. This has just been awesome playbook for helping people manage all stages of growth.
Great. Thank you, Ken.
Thanks, Dave. All right, welcome back to the studio. Cannon and Claudia with you. Claudia, this continued a blockbuster conversation with
Absolutely.
This part 2. It was awesome. We'll get into kind of the 2 quick things we would take away from it. But first, what did you think about the episode?
I loved his points about managing disruptions. It's really rare to find an entrepreneur that's been through the 2008 recession and the COVID crisis, let alone the dot-com bubble bursting, the 2008 recession, and then COVID. And so his experience is just so unique, and hearing what he learned from each situation and brought with him into the next, this is why we love doing this show, because it's so valuable for other entrepreneurs that haven't had that experience to not have to maybe learn the hard way.
Yeah, such a great point. And listen to him talk about as he navigated those disruptions, he had different businesses in each one at a different stage. So it gave him some special insight into things like revenue concentration risk and how to recover from that, and what long-term contracting can mean and the benefits of that. So yeah, it was so rich to hear him talk about all 3 of those over the decades, and sets up perfectly, I think, the first point we want to take away from this and highlight are those inflection points for your business. During those disruptions, his businesses were at different stages. And, he talked about those inflection points your business naturally hits in milestones. And it was done in the context, remember, I asked him what's more important, growth or profitability? He said both are important, but he added a third component, which is about pace and time. What pace are you growing and what time has it been? And it kind of does show his mindset is about growth, right? And scaling for growth. And not every entrepreneur is going to try to hit that pace. But that when you look at those inflection points on revenue, you remember what they were. He said, 1 million, and we agree with this, right? 1 million is kind of that first inflection point. 5 million in revenues, kind of a natural next one, and 10 million, even a natural next one there. And, there's a steep learning curve at each point, and each one requires doing things differently.
Yeah, in the earliest stage for a service business, he talks about how at its core, you have to turn a profit within the first 12 months, or you have a problem because there might be a fundamental problem in figuring out your business. It's really important to figure out managing pricing and the delivery model early on and when starting your business.
Absolutely. It's such a key point. The earliest stage, you've got to show that you understand pricing and cost of goods sold and things like that so that you prove the model out. And here, again, he says do it quickly, right? I often say prove your model out first before doing anything else. He actually says do it quickly, right? So it shows his mindset about scaling for growth. But either way, such a key point. And once you've proven the profitability along the way, that lets you say, all right, and so in this market, it's profitable, or, and then if I move into a different market, I replicate the model and do it profitably. And he says that's when you can start introducing growth capital, because, that may drive your profitability down in the near term, but you've already proven that the model works, right? And if you're using third-party capital, they're going to require understanding that. So such a key point. And then the other part I just was fascinating as you move through those milestones or inflection points, he spent time talking about the talent needed at each stage.
Yeah, absolutely. He talks about going from bookkeeper to CFO and ensuring that the team you have is the team that's going to help you reach the next level, which can be really difficult for business owners. Sometimes they feel that sense of loyalty to their staff, which makes sense because they helped you get to where you are. But sometimes that team that got you to 1 million is not always suited to help you get to the next 5.
That's right. Totally. Loyalty, he called it a trap, right? Not so much about loyalty, but he said, entrepreneurs know how to grow, but they don't know how to groom and grow the talent to get them to each stage. And you're right, loyalty can get in the way. It can blind you. You want loyalty. It's so important, but sometimes you outgrow staff. And he did talk about going from bookkeeper to controller and then controller to CFO, each one a strategic upgrade. And it's a natural step in the process. And understanding that as an entrepreneur is so key. The other point we just wanted to highlight is how, and I loved his answer. I said, do you think most entrepreneurs understand their business balance sheet? You remember what he said?
No.
Right. So, and it's true. I mean, entrepreneurs think about, all right, I want more customers, I want more employees, or I need more employees, I want more products. And they sometimes think debt is bad, right? And I want more cash, more cash. So when you think that way, you miss some key strategic things that financial leverage can bring you. And I think that was a key point Dave was making. And it doesn't mean debt is for everybody, right? There are times when it can be a problem. But if you are in that growth mindset and you are looking to scale and accelerate, you need to understand how financial leverage can help. Do you remember, what Dave learned about debt early on in his career?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he says that he regretted not taking on debt earlier because it can be such a helpful tool. And he had that mindset of debt is bad just across the board. And once he kind of changed his mindset, he realized the different ways that you can leverage it and how it can be beneficial to your business, obviously, depending on business model and what stage your business is at. He reiterated, you don't want to take it on too early.
Yeah, don't want to take it on too early, but you want to prove the model works. And it's okay. He said he learned, in his view, the hard way because he would use retained earnings and cash when he went to a new market. And it was much more deliberate. It was more measured growth. And for some entrepreneurs with a different risk profile, that's fine. That's perfect. But Dave says if you want higher octane growth and you understand the model, debt will be your friend in that regard. He said leverage actually meant a lot to him. And he's right, because leverage is that concept of really making that business work for you when you pull that lever and drive growth. So such an interesting concept. He also, go back and listen if you have time, about the equity, about giving away equity too early can be expensive. His thoughts on that are so important as you're seeking growth capital. And business conditions being good is a good time to recap. But I thought we would close here. We just talked about the business balance sheet, but he kind of touched on the personal balance sheet too. And he said a quote that I love. He said, "It's important to take risk off the table first
before paying yourself. Take risk off the table first before paying yourself. And, that risk off the table is about the business balance sheet, and paying yourself gets into your own balance sheet. But his key point was, you need to have a stable business first. That stability means that the business is running and it's dependable, and those future cash flows are going to be dependable. So don't pay yourself too early until you get those things in place, because then you're able to insulate yourself and your own balance sheet. And, many entrepreneurs have taken on personal guarantees at first to fund the business. And that creates a lot of stress. And, if you can really insulate yourself and get commercial banks to remove those personal guarantees, and the business is off and running, then you can really start paying yourself and sleep better at night. So
Right.
I love that quote. I thought it was a great one. It's a good one to end on. Well, Claudia, thanks as always. Great points. And we look forward to seeing everyone on the next show.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. Are you looking for more resources to help your business? Visit cornercappodcast.com for our free ebooks to help you plan for inevitable transitions in your business. Tune back in every other week for a new episode.